Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peggy Mason, and once again, I have the great pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar, the fifth in our February 2021 sixth session webinar program on Arctic security, and to briefly introduce our three co-sponsors before turning things over to today's moderator, Paul Meyer. Bringing together students, emerging scholars, and Northern stakeholders, rights holders, the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, NADSEN, conducts leading edge research, convenes conferences and workshops, and educates the next generation of policy thinkers and analysts on core Arctic defense and security policy challenges. NADSEN postgraduate fellow Jill Barkley is the webinar series rapporteur. Dr. Shannon Nash, the network manager, and Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer, the network lead, have been instrumental in the organization of this webinar series. And on behalf of the other two co-sponsors, I want to once again extend our deep appreciation and gratitude. The second co-sponsor, the Canadian Pugwash Group, is chaired by retired diplomat Paul Meyer, today's moderator. This organization is the national affiliate of the 1995 Nobel Peace Prize winning Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs of Russell Einstein Manifesto fame, fostering informed discussion and generating policy proposals on global security, including nuclear and conventional arms control, control of the arms trade, and environmental security, is the mandate of the Canadian Pugwash Group. The third co-sponsor, the Rideau Institute, of which I am president, engages in independent policy relevant research and analysis, advocacy, and social media engagement with a view to the development of a Canadian international security policy that embodies the UN Charter principles of multilateral cooperation, the peaceful resolution of disputes, and the progressive strengthening of international law. Please note that the proceedings are being recorded for future public availability. And with the help of our rapporteur, it is our intention to publish the proceedings to serve as an education tool, to promote debate, and to provide policy recommendations. The keynote presentations and the previous three panels are all now available on video on the NADSEN website under past events. I am now very pleased to turn things over to our moderator, Paul Meyer, retired career diplomat, including having served as Canada's ambassador for disarmament and the current chair of the Canadian Pugwash Group. Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you, Peggy, and welcome to everyone participating in the webinar. As chair of the Canadian Pugwash Group, I'm delighted to have been able to collaborate with our two other organizers in putting this webinar series forward on a crucial topic. So today the focus is on resurgent great power competition. What does it mean for Arctic security and stability? And we will have the benefit of two eminent scholars' perspective on this topic, Dr. Andrea Charon and Dr. Nancy Teeple. Andrea Charon has her PhD from the Royal Military College. She has experience working with several federal government departments, including the Privy Council offices, Secretariat of Security and Intelligence. She is currently an associate professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba, and she serves as director of the university's Center for Defense and Security Studies. Dr. Nancy Teeple has a PhD from Simon Fraser University, and she is now postdoctoral fellow with the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. She's also an adjunct professor and research associate at the Department of Political Science and Economics of the Royal Military College. Nancy's research interests include nuclear strategy and deterrence, missile defense issues, arms control, and Arctic security. So we will hear approximately for 15 minutes presentations from the two speakers, and then there'll be ample time for questions and answers. So I'll first ask Andrea to take the floor and provide her presentation.
Very much. Thanks very much. I have to mission control here. This is far more difficult sometimes. I want to thank Peggy and Paul and Shannon and of course all the sponsors for putting this together and for inviting me today. It's really an honor to be here. I thought maybe what I would do is sort of set the stage and start with the start by asking the sort of the global view of great power competition, and then see if in fact this actually does apply to the Arctic. So my bottom line up front is that I'm not sure that the resurgence and emergence of Russia and China is of the same level of concern as it is in other parts of the world. Rather, competition in the Arctic is buffered thanks to organizations like the Arctic Council, which have established for 25 years now an Arctic state versus non-Arctic state governance structure, as opposed to a great power versus everybody else in sort of the rest of the world. If we don't take steps to improve continental defense, however, I think this vulnerability will be exploited, and then the great power game in Asia and Europe may indeed find its way to North America. Now is definitely a critical time to consider how great power competition may have involved the Arctic and its implications. While we may think the resurgence of Russia and the emergence of China is a direct result of President Trump, I want to remind everybody that the signs came much earlier under the Obama administration's June 2015 National Military Strategy. It was placed, however, at the center of the Trump administration's December 2017 National Security Strategy, and then the January 2018 National Defense Strategy. Military officials under the Trump administration have made countering Chinese military capabilities the #1 concern. This, however, was always pitched in an Indo-Pacific context. The question becomes, does the great power competition apply in an Arctic context? In the last year, the US military seems to have bolted ahead of US national strategy via its pivot to the Arctic, and in some cases with very hurried armed services specific Arctic strategies, rather than operational responses to a coherent national strategy. And they seem to be focusing almost exclusively on great power competition in the Arctic. The question still remains is whether the rest of the US military budget and institutional momentum will follow. 20 years after 9/11, the focus of the US military and Canada as an ally, which was on the Middle East and on countering terrorism, has been replaced back to Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and then to a pivot to Asia, and now tentatively a mini pivot to the Arctic. The pivots have resulted in different coalitions in each case and different levels of attention. I think we in North America feel the pivot to the Arctic acutely, but that's a function of geography and sparse infrastructure. The bigger issue and stickier problem will continue to be containment of China in a Pacific context and Russia in a European context. Nevertheless, as a result of renewed great power competition and with two peer competitors, there are 3 premises and a conclusion for the Arctic. The first is that everyone is dusting off their deterrence handbooks and rediscovering that nuclear weapons are a grave and imminent danger. Number 2, the US way of war and momentum means that US and allied capabilities will be focused in the Pacific and US and NATO attention in Europe. This is what Joel Sokolsky referred to as the away game. Knowing full well the first two, Chinese and Russian tactics are to exploit the North American homeland, especially via gray zone tactics, as well as other geographic combatant command seams that other than US CENTCOM are located in the middle of oceans, out of sight and out of mind, and in international waters. The conclusion to be drawn from successive NORAD and US NORTHCOM commanders is that the continental defense can be exploited because it has always been marginalized in favor of this away game, especially as argued by General Retired O'Shaughnessy and current Deputy Director of Operations for NORAD, Brigadier General Fessler. The Arctic is a significant part of the North American homeland and likely to become more accessible. But it also has 3 combatant command seams coupled with aged infrastructure that provides key information like the North Warning System, and this perhaps accounts for the hurried attention to the US services to the North American Arctic. Remember, NORAD's main focus for 63 years has been the Arctic. The number of Russian sorties has ebbed and flowed, but the behavior has remained, in the main, professional. That is not the case in other parts of the world. Example, poisonings in the United Kingdom, annexation of territories, and jamming of GPS signals near Svalbard and the coast of Norway. The term geopolitics and great power politics are often synonymous for international politics or strategy relating to international politics. More specifically, it refers to the influence of basic geographic features. And when we're talking about the Arctic, we have one defining feature, and that's an ocean. We think of the Arctic as a maritime domain only, and there are advantages and disadvantages to that. The main advantage is that the Arctic Ocean, as outlined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, has fairly clearly defined zones under national and international jurisdiction. We really haven't had to worry much about the international donut hole until recently as a result of technology and climate change. The disadvantage, and again, this is rooted in the same UNCLOS, is the fact that the rights are determined by land, not by water. And this preferences Arctic states over non-Arctic states for decision-making. Herein lies a fundamental challenge. The Arctic Council has preserved this hierarchy, which means that 2 P5 members of the UN Security Council are Arctic states, Russia and the US, and the other 3 are observers, along with 10 other states, some quite important potential powers like India, and one, of course, the most anticipated power to the US, China. The basis of US grand strategy to deal with potential competitors has been to keep them from having the freedom to roam like the US has. The problem is that Russia has always had that ability, although it was more concerned about its near abroad. But China's ability to roam is very new, and via its Belt and Road Initiative, it is reaching deeper into parts of the world than the West thought possible in a few years, and far below the threshold of war. Indeed, in many cases, the injections of infrastructure and cash along the Belt and Road are development lifesavers, and the West simply has no counter offer or alternatives. While US has a grand strategy to ensure national interests, Canada has a fit where we can strategy, and that depends heavily on where the US goes and what niche roles we can play. The US clearly made counterterrorism and the Middle East the clear grand strategy priorities immediately post 9/11, and then the shift to the Pacific by the Obama administration, even renaming PACOM to Indo-PACOM in recognition of the significance of Asia. More of the world lives in Asia than outside of it, and its economic might well eclipse the US if the West continues to dismantle free trade between allies. I'm not prepared to say that the entire US military is shifting to the Arctic, and as evidence, I turn to policy and money. For example, the Marine Corps' current plan to redesign its forces, called Force Design 2030, is driven primarily by a need to better prepare the Marine Corps for potential operations against Chinese forces in conflict in the Western Pacific. And the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act directed the DoD to establish a Pacific Deterrence Initiative to, quote, to carry out prioritized activities to enhance the United States deterrence and defense posture in the Indo-Pacific region. When it comes to Russia and its aggressivity, it is the Balkans and Europe which are still more at risk. And the US, via multiple presidents and not just Trump, has needed to convince NATO allies that they must spend more on national defense. NATO has reconfigured its commands in a transformation that has seen the reconstitution of a new version of the SACLAND position, now called Joint Task Force Norfolk, based in Norfolk, Virginia, and twinned with the Second Fleet commander, who is Vice Admiral Lewis. His counterpart on the NATO side is the commander of US Naval Forces Europe, Commander US Naval Forces Africa, and Commander Allied Joint Forces Command Naples, who is Admiral Burke. But Lewis's US counter under EUCOM is the Sixth Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Black. The Second and the Sixth Fleet both have areas of responsibility in the Arctic and in North Atlantic, but the Sixth Fleet also has the Mediterranean and the top half of Africa. The one line they both adhere to strictly is 45 degrees west, which is the line in the Atlantic that separates US Northcom from EUCOM and cuts Greenland in half. The joke in the naval world is that the most likely conflict in the Arctic will be between the Second and the Sixth Fleet, fighting for capabilities, resources, and operations from the twinned US NATO, US EUCOM admiral. And finally, in a report to Congress released the 27th of January 2021, entitled Renewed Great Power Competition, Implications for Defense, Issues for Congress, there is not a single reference to the Arctic. So if US grand strategy is not including the Arctic in its calculations, should Canada? This is the conundrum and is the key argument of successive NORAD and US Northcom commanders who have pleaded with US and Canadian officials to pay attention to continental defense, which includes the North American Arctic. While we have heard lots of references to North Warning System renewal and NORAD modernization and even an evolution of North American defense, what we don't have are the concomitant budgets, capabilities, or political backing. Canada has had a more realistic and tempered view of the Arctic than has the US. And we realize that there is in fact a continuum of activities that occur. Some occur at the defense end, requiring the need for interceptors to defeat incoming air threats, for example. And there are many activities at the safety end, representing the sole mandate, for example, of the Canadian Coast Guard. Canada also integrated Indigenous knowledge, especially via the Rangers. The US has a very uneven attention to this essential partnership. Rather than thinking about great power competition in the Arctic, we are facing competition between Arctic and non-Arctic states, of which there are great powers represented on both sides. We have been incredibly fortunate to have the Arctic Council introduced at a time of relative peace that firmly cemented much of the thinking in the Arctic, something the Asian and European regions lack. There is no organization that seeks to promote cooperation in Europe in which it includes Russia as an active and key decision maker, and the same for the Pacific. China and Russia are the adversaries in these contexts, but not necessarily in the Arctic. The Arctic will become very unstable if Russia and China believe their tactics, such as anti-access area denial and bastion defense, will work in the North American Arctic context, which means the need to heed the calls of the NORAD commanders and commit to continental defense is essential. Canada's contribution is making sure that NORAD modernization and the wider evolution of North American defense does come to fruition, but are also with a view to benefiting Northern residents and cooperating with allies to share more domain information. The one clear advice we do have from the US is that they need and expect more allied support in the Arctic to ensure US deterrence is not compromised by a vulnerable homeland. Canada can contribute valuable information, and especially to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and contribute to what the commander of NORAD and US Northcom Van Herk calls today information dominance. Thanks very much.
Yes, well, thank you, Andrea. And next, we will call upon Nancy to give us the benefit of her presentation. Nancy, you have the Zoom room.
Thank you very much, Paul, and it's an honor to present to you all today. I'm just going to try out my screen sharing so that you can see my slides. Zoom and I have an interesting relationship of things work until I have to do it live. There we go. So what I've done is sort of address the overarching question of today's session. What does resurgent great power competition mean for Arctic security and stability? So mine is kind of a broader overview of great power competition and strategic behavior of the three key actors, Russia, China, and the United States. I provide a context for understanding the regional landscape, a framework for understanding threats to and in and through the Arctic. I consider the impact on security and stability in the region with a look at the role of arms control as a stabilizer in the Arctic. And I conclude with a look at how states' national interests involve cooperation and competition at the same time. So of course, these works build on current works that explore different ways of looking at the Arctic, kind of a departure from the past, focusing on cooperation or competition, and of course, the framework for into and through the Arctic. So I have to attribute much of this to building upon Whitney Lackenbauer's work. So just sort of an overview of the context, the Arctic is a zone of both cooperation and strategic competition concurrently. Cooperative circumpolar relations are enabled through a number of institutions, as you see here, the Arctic Council, the United Nations Law of the Sea, Ilulissat Declaration, the Polar Code, among others. Climate change introduces non-traditional security challenges to the Arctic region. Melting sea ice and longer navigation seasons have led to increasing international activity and access to the region. This includes economic development for oil and gas, of course, minerals, fisheries, tourism, etc. And shipping provides shorter routes from the Asian to the European markets. Of course, all of this includes nations increasing their Arctic military capabilities to defend, deter, and enhance their national sovereignty, and of course, respond to emergencies. So the Arctic region is increasing in strategic importance and economic potential. Military strategic behaviors of the key actors create something known as a security dilemma, an international relations theory in which states that view one another as competitors are suspicious of one another's actors. So one state might start militarizing for its own defense, and another state sees that as a threat, a challenge. So it responds in kind, and it kind of turns into a spiral of competition, and is usually based around the perception or misperception that the other state might be getting ready to take offensive action. So this is something that's commonly seen, and in this context, it's not much different. And of course, the primary great power actors as resurgent Russia, a revisionist China, and of course, the United States pivoting to the Arctic. Great power competition occurs on a global scale, and of course, in this case, regionally, as peer competitors pursue long-term economic and security interests in the Arctic. The strategic behavior of peer competitors that creates challenges involving potentially provocative developments are the rising China as a peer competitor to the US with Arctic ambitions, Russia's control of the Northern Sea route, posing a freedom of navigation challenge to the US and other challenges. Russian advances in missile technology involving the testing and deployment of systems in the Arctic. And as we heard earlier from Andrea, Russia and China are developing missile capabilities with the intention to hold at risk critical sites in the US and Canada, so the North American side of the Arctic. The absence of a regional organization or forum to manage military and security issues is problematic. And of course, the growing strategic cooperation between Russia and China. And so I'll kind of break down in the following slides on each state's strategic behaviors. So how we're looking at this too is just sort of a framework to keep in the back of your mind, a helpful way to think about great power competition in the Arctic, to contextualize actors and events in the Arctic. So this is a framework attributed to Whitney Lackenbauer. Number one, there are different Arctics, and I've outlined 3 of them here: the North American Arctic, the European Arctic, the Central Arctic Ocean, and there are others as well. But these are sort of key in this discussion. And of course, the understanding threats in, through, and to the Arctic. And Wilfred Greaves had actually presented threats from the Arctic. So I thought I'd include that here because we have great power threats being posed by, for example, Russia's ability to threaten North America with standoff weapons and patrols in or from and through the Arctic. Russia's threats to European states in the Arctic, such as Norway, and Chinese posing potential threats to and in the Arctic, and potentially in the future through the Arctic. So this leads us to a series of questions for consideration. How could great power dynamics affect security and stability in the Arctic? Well, what do we mean by security and stability? Security from both traditional and non-traditional perspectives. Obviously, human, environmental, economic, and political and strategic dimension, which will be our kind of a focus in kind of a realist perspective. Stability would be more characterized by a low tension or a low security dilemma, so low tensions between nations in the security dilemma. This is reinforced through cooperative frameworks and adherence to legal regimes and norms of behavior, and ultimately provides a predictability through transparency and dialogue. Another question is, to what extent could military developments and resulting tensions undermine the cooperative framework of circumpolar relations? Some of these include tensions in other geopolitical regions spilling over into the Arctic, and the escalation of a confrontation or miscalculation creating a crisis. And potential impacts of these are states withdrawing from agreements, wedges driven between states or between states and their own citizens, and the weakening of institutions and arrangements. So a brief overview: Russian strategic behavior involves provocative, or at least provocative to the West, military activity which contributes to the security dilemma, revitalizing and building new Arctic bases and ports. This shows these along the Northern Sea Route, modernizing and developing new conventional and nuclear weapons systems, the deployment of regional denial systems, air defenses, and anti-ship missiles, resurgent military exercises in various parts of the Arctic, and increasing economic cooperation with China. And the most prevalent of these are the liquefied natural gas projects in Yamal Peninsula and other projects related, and Chinese investment and cooperation in the Northern Sea Route. China's Arctic reach is a result of economic and scientific research interests in the region, but these are also giving rise to Chinese seeking to make claims in the Arctic, particularly the Central Arctic Ocean. China declared itself a near Arctic state in its 2018 policy. It's exploring the Polar Silk Road as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, which does include, as I mentioned earlier, the LNG development with Russia, administration of the Northern Sea Route, and investments in states that are somewhat economically vulnerable and looking for opportunity, such as Iceland and Greenland. And this also includes the challenge of predatory economics being exploited in the region, and the potential use of economic coercion then, and control with political strategic implications. And finally, challenges of dual use, the potential for military applications of infrastructure, scientific research, and other things that could potentially be used down the road for military purposes, such as the purchase of ports and air bases or other types of projects in the deep sea. So I have here Western strategic behavior that obviously at least alludes to US-led, but it's kind of that overarching either Canada-US or US-NATO context. So the US and Canada are modernizing the North American defense. context and renewing NORAD. This includes evolving defense and deterrence concepts and the architecture to counter Russian and Chinese missile advances. Such systems are advanced enough to travel through the Arctic, threatening the North American homeland. This is embodied in the new SHIELD concept and deterrence concepts kind of being explored for to be able to deny deterrence by resilience to strengthen at home, strengthen and hardening systems. And deterrence by deception, this is on the offensive or information operations side. And if you're interested in that dimension, you should explore the works by Troy Bouffard. So another is the US military branches, as Andrea mentioned, releasing a series of Arctic strategies, reinforcing joint force concepts, responding to various traditional and non-traditional security threats in the Arctic. And what's unique about this is that new branches that have never released an Arctic strategy before are doing so, such as the Air Force or the forthcoming Army strategy. So this is unprecedented. So we can definitely see a pivot to the Arctic. Another is increased NATO and Nordic defense cooperation. NATO exercises in the European Arctic in and around Norway, involving non-NATO states as well, like Sweden and Finland. And these are all potentially provocative to Russia in the region. Russia perceives increasing NATO activity near its borders as a threat and ascribes offensive intention to the US and NATO in these kinds of behaviors. So that's something to keep in mind. So with that, I posed some controversial questions that I have some kind of answers to, or responses to, not answers. We may be able to get into it in a bit, but we don't have as much time. So I just thought I'd pose them there. Threats and challenges. These threats and challenges and these questions are debated among scholars, and that's why I indicated they were controversial. And number one is, what is the potential for armed conflict in the Arctic? Obviously low potential, and we'll get into that later. Another is, should the Arctic Council be expanded to cover military security matters? Should NATO become more involved in the Arctic? And finally, is there Arctic exceptionalism that cannot be affected by geopolitical development? Arctic exceptionalism is the notion that the Arctic is a zone of peace and cooperation governed by institutions to resolve disputes, and the region, as a result of its exceptional cooperative character, is unaffected by great power competition. And that's also debated more recently. So preliminary outcomes in terms of the impact on security and stability. Number one, it's uncertain. There's speculation about possible outcomes given the trajectories of activities to date, but we can consider potential outcomes such as great power competition may have impacts on the security and stability in certain parts of the Arctic, whereas not in others. Conflict in the region is unlikely, although confrontation and points of escalation may occur in the European Arctic. China is a bit of a wild card. It has the potential to drive a wedge between states, to become a security threat through dual use Arctic capabilities, and its interest and push to become more involved in regional politics and Arctic governance. The Arctic Council will remain a cooperative forum. However, whether it will diminish or become ineffectual if the Arctic cooperative regime becomes undermined, this is uncertain. And of course, strategic nuclear and conventional competition could impact the cooperative framework. On the positive side, as arms control has a stabilizing effect. And with that, I wanted to talk briefly in terms of that, the role of missile technologies and the post-arms control context. So we're living in a post-anti-ballistic missile treaty world, a post-intermediate range nuclear forces world, the treaty that the US withdrew from. And do these create conditions for arms races? Nuclear weapons obviously have a significant role in great power competition. New START was set to expire and was recently renewed, but this is the last remaining bilateral arms control treaty between the nuclear great powers, the US and Russia. Whether it will be renegotiated within the next 5 years is under consideration. New conventional and nuclear delivery technologies are faster, more maneuverable, stealthy, precise, and accurate, which is quite destabilizing, both globally and regionally. The breakdown of arms control leading to arms race behavior could have an impact in the Arctic. This concerns the role of the Arctic in deployments of nuclear systems and missile defenses in the region. And nuclear weapon testing in the Arctic has security implications at the local and regional level, the IN, involving radiation poisoning of inhabitants and measures taken to try to contain any kind of further contamination. We don't have time to go through these all, but in response to new U.S. Missile defense expansion and deployments of Aegis in the European theater caused Vladimir Putin to respond, unveiling a series of systems in his speech in Moscow in March 2018, where he said, "No one listened to us, listen now." And these are systems intended to defeat or at least bypass missile defenses and threaten North America or on the European side. So essentially, Russia can target North America while remaining below the nuclear threshold. It can attack the United States if there's a conflict in another geographical region. And the intent is to prevent or delay deployment to these theaters. And of course, shorter and medium range systems can reach targets in the European Arctic, such as the Barents Sea. So arms control would provide stabilization in the Arctic. Arms control cooperation could reinforce cooperation in the Arctic with a positive spillover into regional relationships and possibly elsewhere. It would bring problematic nuclear technologies into New START and limit missile defenses, so this would be really important. It would address dual use systems, targeting such systems when states are being targeted, they can't necessarily differentiate that a missile targeting them has either a conventional or nuclear warhead. Discussions on arm control could consider controlling tactical or theater warheads, which New START doesn't. And another item is proposals for an Arctic nuclear weapon-free zone. This would limit or prohibit nuclear behavior in the Arctic through either bi or multilateral agreements, which would reinforce cooperation, transparency, and confidence building among key great powers in the region, and possibly on a broader global level. So these are just some important items for consideration in terms of enhancing cooperation and security and stability in the region. But coming back, I just want to conclude with this last slide. It kind of shows how great powers' national interests span both the cooperative and competitive areas. And so these are happening concurrently. And we have to consider sort of down the road, will there be a point where it will shift in one direction or another, or just sort of continue in this way. So, for example, it's in Russia's national interest that the Arctic remains a zone of cooperation to facilitate resource development and resolve disputes peacefully. But it's competitive in its interest in controlling the Northern Sea route, ensuring the survivability of its strategic deterrent, and maintaining the ability to use military forces in the Arctic, and of course, keeping NATO out of the Arctic and away from its borders. China's national interests are in accessing, having access to Arctic shipping routes, exploiting resources, exercising influence, and participating in Arctic working groups and scientific research. But the influence dimension has a competitive aspect. Arctic ambitions of China are uncertain and ambiguous. Economic ambitions have predatory character, and investments have potentially dual capable civil military uses. For the United States, it's in their national interest to cooperate through the Arctic Council among other regional arrangements for human and environmental security, economic development, and the resolution of territorial disputes. But the competitive side is that it is pivoting to the Arctic, and military branches are pursuing joint concepts and responses through Alaska. And these are responses to traditional and non-traditional threats and challenges in the region. And of course, the modernization of the North American defense architecture, well perceived as defensive, it does use offensive, I would say offensive concepts, offensive systems in order to demonstrate the ability to threaten its adversaries in order to ensure that the continent is more secure as a result. So we see like this trend, and as I mentioned, there could be a point in the future where it could go in one direction or the other, but it could be debated whether these cooperation and competition will continue to move forward side by side with little impact in the region. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Yes, well, thanks, Nancy, and I commend you on that great photograph that you have on your last slide of the submarine being investigated by 3 polar bears. That's a pretty marvelous picture. I wonder if maybe they were Canadian Rangers in disguise or something, but we'll leave that. Well, look at we've benefited from really quite rich and insightful presentations now, and we can dig a little deeper in the question and answer segment. I'll incorporate what we're getting in, plus just to kick us off, I think I'd like to ask Andrea about a point she makes in the presentation regarding the US military sort of running ahead of US governmental policy. And I wondered if the Biden administration is likely to sort of rein in the military on this, or is it just not going to focus? And if I can supplement that with a question that Mark has put in your opinion, how could US military capability be best utilized in the Arctic? And is there a role for US allies to supplement that activity? So maybe you could get us underway with responses to those questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, I think we are going to see Biden sort of resetting many agendas. In some cases, he's completely reversed decisions that Trump had made. In other occasions, it's sort of an adjustment or a different emphasis. And I think that's what we can expect in the case of the Arctic. What we really should have, and this was an argument made in War on the Rocks, it really should be the US national security strategy that sort of sets the tone for what do we expect to happen in the Arctic. And then the military services provide operational guidance to their armed services via the strategies. But what we see is the armed services have come out ahead with the strategy for the US, and that's really putting the cart before the horse. So I fully expect, especially with the Arctic Council meeting in May with the handover to Russia, that US Secretary of State Blinken is going to sort of reset the tone. And this also speaks to Mark's question. Coincidentally, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, and Denmark are all due to issue new Arctic strategies. And from what I'm hearing, it is very much a return to let's talk about high north, low tension. Let's talk about Russia certainly has, defensive capabilities. We need to watch them, but let's not assume automatically always nefarious intent. We need to work together for other issues. And I expect everybody is going to put climate change first on their agendas, and that really is pressing for the Arctic. And so I think that's where we're hoping we're going to see much more leadership on the part of the US via Biden. I hope the first thing they do is take the Department of Homeland Security's Arctic strategy, rip it up, throw it in the garbage. How you can have a strategy that refuses to mention the word climate change, as Troy Buffard has pointed out, is not tenable. And so I really think we're all looking for that quiet leadership to come back with Biden, because the Arctic has been working. We need it to continue to work because we can't possibly have fronts open on all parts of the world, and that we focus on the really pressing issues of climate change.
Great. I think both you and Nancy refer to the shield, the modernization or upgrading of US-Canadian defense systems in the Arctic. And if I can pose a question that both Peggy but also Adele have put forward, is I mean, Nancy, you referred to the security dilemma, and are we, in a sense, in looking to invest in renewed northern defenses, just contributing to a security dilemma response from the other side? And Adele, in particular, notes that new weapon systems, seem to maybe make irrelevant some of the radar-based systems that the sort of successor to the North Warning System would entail. So I'd like to get thoughts from both panelists on this. Are we in danger of contributing to an escalatory a cycle at the very time when we might want to try to encourage greater stability and de-escalation in military actions in that area? So who wants to take up that first? Well, Nancy, go ahead, and then Andrea.
Sure. And that's the thing. Andrea's the expert on the North Warning System, so she'll give some great insights following. But in terms of I always kind of work within the security dilemma framework in terms of thinking about how nations compete, especially in the nuclear realm. But of course, what we're looking at are destabilizing systems with conventional warheads now on them, for better or worse, to meet new START numbers, but also to, lower the use of these weaponry from the nuclear threshold and below. So yeah, I see the whole thing as kind of a spiral of, the US withdrew from the ABM treaty, it pursued national missile defenses, it later pursued, Aegis defenses in the European theater. And I'm not saying this as an advocate in one way or another, I'm just sort of looking at the situation objectively. And of course, adversaries will respond in kind because the idea is mutual vulnerability with reinforced by survivable second strike capabilities tends to keep tensions lower. There's always going to be a security dilemma if you view one another as competitors, but that tension will be low if both nations are less incentivized to use these weapons because they know that some sort of retaliation will come. But of course, the more usable systems with lower yield warheads, conventional warheads, more precise, and the ability to get past systems that would otherwise be able to defend, because the idea is that if one state has an advantage over the other having these missile defenses, the other state wants to restore some sort of parity, some sort of balance, right? And so that's how I perceive Russia and China's developing of hypersonic glide vehicles, next generation cruise missiles, these other types of systems. So on the one hand, you see the modernizing systems, right? Because a lot of these kind of fell out, during the 1990s and post-Cold War period, but post-ABM, it seems that there's kind of been a shift to modernizing systems, and why not modernize with more offensive capabilities to try to restore that kind of balance? Because if one state, as I said, has an advantage, the other state's going to respond with a way to exploit the vulnerabilities, the seams, as Andrea had mentioned. So I guess with that, that's my impression. So the pursuit of the shield concept is an attempt to defend even stronger against that. But interestingly, the challenge is kind of shifting. I would say deterrence by denial has been a thing since the Cold War, but being explicit about this kind of doctrine and then focusing on offensive ways of ensuring that is a new thing. Being declaratory about that's new. So what I'll do is I'll pass it on to Andrea, and if you have any follow-up questions, let me know.
Okay.
Thanks. This really, often these questions remind us that the US and Canada are different, because we do see, questions of missile defense very differently. In the US, their questions are always, what's the cost and what's the most credible system? Never need. Need is always assumed to be there. In Canada, we have cost, what's the credibility of the system, and why would we need it? We're Canada. No one wants to attack us. And we've always had a disconnect in terms of the conversation. But I think what you're starting to see as technology advances, the US is also starting to think, we only have so many dollars to spend. And COVID-19 has been really instructive, because here we have a virus that has dismantled and destabilized many, many countries around the world, including the US. And it didn't involve a missile. It involved a virus. And when you think back to the problems that the US has had with China and with Russia of late, it's not missiles. Again, it's gray zone activity, it's misinformation, disinformation, it's using bots on the internet. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that the 2021 Congressional Budget Office has just released a study on cruise missile defense for the US. And it's quite clear they're very concerned about the cost versus, are we going to be able to have a credible system? Because we can't possibly protect every site in continental US, let alone North America. It costs an incredible amount of money. And oh, by the way, our competitors can get at us very, very cheaply via these gray zone tactics. So I think, again, you're going to see this idea of a shield is often thought of as like the equivalent of the Iron Dome for Israel. The shield that General Retired O'Shaughnessy and Fessler were really talking about is an approach to the importance of North America in, wider defense strategy for the rest of, US and Canadian policy. And so the new word that certainly the new commander wants is information dominance. The more we know about China and Russia and their intentions, the more we include information from other domains, the more likely we are to be out in front ahead of them. And so this brings up the North Warning System, which is just one small part of this bigger thing called NORAD modernization. The North Warning System is the main source of information for NORAD, and successive commanders have said that, well, that's enough. That's not enough. We have allies. We need their information. We need to think about improving the North Warning System, but there's a new program called Pathfinder, a new initiative, which is taking the current North Warning System and through things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, helping analysts to see more of what the North Warning System picks up. But our ability to see those patterns just can't keep up with the technology. But with the help of artificial intelligence, using more information from allies, maybe we don't need to completely put billions of dollars into brand new systems. Maybe there are things we can do to augment the capabilities of current systems. And what you're hearing from the US is, we need allied support, we need allied support, we need allied support. And I think that is definitely going to continue. The expectation is that everybody has to contribute with all the information they have, so that we don't need to come down to these very, very expensive missile defense systems, which may or may not be able to address all the new technology that's coming at us. And now missiles coming from, any place in the world, which is something before we didn't have to consider as well.
Very good. Well, let me try to merge a couple of questions here. Brian has asked about Canadian policy perhaps being neglectful of allies like Denmark and Iceland. Should we be doing more with these countries? And to integrate as well, Adele's question, noting that Denmark has shown some support, at least in the aspirational terms, for the idea of an Arctic nuclear weapon-free zone, and she's asking whether Canada and other Nordic countries might be able to move that project forward in any way. So, welcome responses to those who would like to lead us off. Nancy, you want to?
I was going to suggest, Andrew, if you want to take that first question, because I can't speak so much to the Greenland and Iceland question.
Yeah.
I could do the nuclear weapon-free zone, but I'll let Andrea go
Yeah,
first.
sure. So I think there's a recognition on the part of NATO, the US, all of the allies that they need to work together in a more integrated fashion. It used to be, NATO does stuff over here, NORAD does stuff over here. There was a combatant command team, but we don't really need to, we'll cover it. And we're realizing now maybe that's not the case, and we're especially seeing this when it comes to Greenland and Iceland, because they've always been in very geostrategically important places, but they're starting to come back into play. And so one of the things you're starting to see NATO do is specify which states hold which positions, especially when it comes to an Arctic context. Because one of the things they've realized with big exercises like 2018 Trident Juncture that involved, almost all of the NATO states, is that not all the NATO states are capable of participating in the Arctic at the same level. Maybe some states can contribute information as opposed to actually ships to operate in the Arctic. And so you're seeing this recognition that NATO and especially US Northcom needs to work more closely together, which is why you have this creation of the Joint Task Force Norfolk, which, basically cements US Northcom and NATO to work more closely in a maritime context in the Arctic and North Atlantic. The one thing I'll say about Greenland is we have to be careful that we don't use Greenland, especially like a pawn. Denmark feels that acutely. Greenland is still under Denmark. It is not yet a sovereign state. It may very well be that if Greenland ever does achieve sovereignty, that it may feel it's more aligned with the North American partners, but that we are careful not to assume what's going to happen. I mean, ultimately, Denmark still has that say. And so that's why you have this uncomfortable scene that sort of cuts Greenland in half. And so that's something to watch in the future. And Greenland has some key US assets. Certainly you can't refuel in the North American Arctic without being in Greenland. So I think all the allies are well aware of the contributions of Greenland, Denmark, and Iceland. We still have the NATO policing operations that we do on behalf of Iceland. That's still continuing. So I think you're seeing more concerted efforts to integrate and share information, especially with the NATO Arctic partners.
Good. And Nancy?
So I'll hit up the second question the best way I can. So this was a question about Canada and Nordic countries moving forward, or how they might move forward on the nuclear weapon-free zone concept. So I've scribbled a few considerations. So one of these is obviously exploring the interests. As Andrea even mentioned, different states will have different positions on this, but we can suggest that Canada and the Nordic countries would have a vested incentive for a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Arctic. So what has to be considered there is obviously the whole region, at least to start out with, it's unlikely. I mean, circumpolar Arctic is huge, and considerations involve US operations there, and of course Russia's Northern Fleet, which a great part of Russia's nuclear assets are in its Arctic region. So what needs to be considered are limited zones, exclusion zones, things like that, to start out with as on a proposal to at least get these other nations, these nuclear powers, even to the table to discuss this, right? And I guess the question would be, is this a bilateral? Maybe it would be for the region, or multilateral. Can you enforce other nations that might seek to operate nuclear assets in the region? Does that include primarily the maritime domain? Does that include the air domain? And so what does that mean? And I guess ultimately the question is as to what extent that would interfere with US and Russian interests in that region. The other thing is a dialogue needs to get started then with the governments of these countries, because we've seen a trend over the last 20 years of kind of in Canada at least, a decline of engagement, at least the Canadian government, of engagement in nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. Not entirely absent, but a significant decline compared to how it did in the 1990s and the 1980s and whatnot. So there needs to be a way to kind of bridge, again, Canadian government, global affairs and advocacy organizations that really want to move forward with this initiative, and not just in the Canadian context, or maybe that's a place to start, but really moving this with these other nations and getting the right actors to the table to consider this seriously. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I wonder, it's sort of related in terms of incremental steps towards this, and it recalls for me an idea that Ernie Regier has put forward, which, if I got it correctly, is essentially that to reconsider an idea from the past, which was a keep out zone for US attack submarines, or for that matter, I guess, allied NATO attack submarines, with respect to the so-called Russian bastion, where their SSBNs, their submarines that can launch strategic ballistic missiles reside. And in order to avoid destabilizing actions, recognizing that a secure second strike capability is a stabilizing feature for a nuclear deterrent relationship, whether that's the sort of arms control measure that might be advanced at this time. So again, any thoughts as to the viability of that kind of restraint measure going forward?
Absolutely. So if I understand you correctly, and Ernie's work as well, yeah, these kinds of incremental steps and keep out zones sort of focus on keeping those second strike capabilities closer to one zone in the Arctic, right? That's what my understanding is. So it's limited, and it might kind of have more receptivity to the US and Russia. So I guess the idea of anything that would threaten those second strike, absolutely, that could be a good start, with the potential for, I guess, moving towards kind of covering broader regions. Because if your boomers have intercontinental range, is it necessary for them to roam in further out from these areas in the first place? I mean, the whole point of the attack submarines is to be able to seek out and target these boomers, which are supposed to provide that secure second strike. So this could be a step moving towards in the right direction. So yeah, agreed. Thank you.
Well, I'm a bit of a pessimist, but I mean, I think ultimately hegemons want the freedom to roam, and they're not going to restrict themselves that way. I think that what you have heard in the background is the need for what we have in the South and East China Sea, which is a code for unexpected events. It's called the Qs, the code for unplanned encounters, excuse me. And that maybe the time has come, and especially as Russia is taking over as the chair of the Arctic Council and is looking for wins. I mean, they want to be seen to be a good Arctic Council leader, and everybody wants wins coming out off of their 2-year chairships, and that we might be able to agree, not as part of the Arctic Council, but the Arctic Council is often a launch platform for discussions outside of that maybe we start with just agreements about the kind of activities that are acceptable in the Arctic and what are not, both from a climate environmental protection perspective, but also because it is a very, very dangerous part of the world to operate in, and search and rescue is so far in distance, and so it works to everybody's benefit. The activities that absolutely have to stop are things like the jamming of GPS signals. by Russia. I mean, that is just unacceptable. That is not professional. And really, we need to put pressure on them to stop that. And so I think we take the opportunity of Russia as chair, looking for, having some big at the end of their 2 years to say, look, we did this and this and this. So far, all indications are that they will be focusing on, environmental protection and sustainable development. But outside of that context could be, some agreement about better behavior. And I would love to see the Open Skies Treaty be reconstituted, because that has been vital, especially in the Arctic context, again, because, when you crash land, you can't pick up the phone and say, come and get us now. So I'd like to see also Open Skies perhaps be reinvigorated.
Great. Well, we're running out of time, but I'd like to pose a final question in relating actually to a question that Nancy mentions in her presentation, which is whether the Arctic Council should expand its agenda to include security issues. And my question to both of you, and if you, in your responses, I would also suggest any kind of final comments you would like to make. Would this be a wise thing for the Arctic Council to do? So maybe just in reverse order of the presentations, Nancy, solicit your views, and as I say, any final comments you'd like to make.
Well, I guess most Arctic specialists advise, at least from my understanding, advise against the Arctic Council bringing military strategic issues into the Arctic Council. And I tend to agree. And the reason why is that it might, I don't want to say muddy the waters a bit, but that cooperative framework that happens in the Arctic, I think, is facilitated through the Arctic Council being non-focused on military or I would say traditional realist security matters. There needs to be some sort of forum explored outside of that. And that's a challenge at this point, because since Crimea and Ukraine, any kind of Western Russian, for example, military cooperation broke down. And so a challenge would be to get some sort of alternative forum that already exists. Some have proposed the NATO-Russia Council or something like that to start exploring the kind of military domain. But I would agree that the Arctic Council is best focused on the closest thing to security would be the search and rescue, and that's it. So with that, I'll pass it on to Andrea.
Yeah, thanks. No, I agree with Nancy. The Arctic Council, it works very well given its current mandate. There's always a danger that when you add things on or change the mandate, that you have to open the agreement. And given the geopolitically contested world, there's maybe we throw out the baby with the bathwater, and we may lose things that we don't want to lose trying to add new things to it. So I think the Arctic Council has a big enough agenda with environmental protection and sustainable development. And like Nancy mentions, it's not that we don't talk about security-like issues in offshoot forums of the Arctic Council, such as the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and the opportunity whenever you have states rubbing up against each other in meetings, they bring up other issues, and who knows what is discussed in the hallways. But we want to keep this organization going, because it does seem to be one of the organizations that continually does produce helpful agreements, is making strides in all sorts of areas, including aiding Indigenous populations across the Arctic with things like telehealth and maintaining languages and the like. So I don't want to mess with something that's working.
Yes, it does seem both of you believe it's most prudent just to keep it going with its cooperative spirit on its present mandate. Well, we've more or less exhausted our time. I just wanted to thank Nancy and Andrea for your insightful comments. You've given us a lot to reflect on going forward. And also appreciate all those who participated in today's webinar. And I'll pass it over to Peggy to close us out. Thanks again.
Thank you, Paul. Well, it's time for me now to also thank our speakers and our moderator on behalf of all of the participants, and to thank our participants for a really great discussion. Really, I think a fabulous discussion. And to remind you that the next session, our final one, panel 5 on conclusions and recommendations for Canadian action, and we certainly got some in the discussion, presentations and discussion today, will take place on Thursday, 18 February from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you all again, and good day.